The 2000s were a strange new place for horror. The paperback boom was gone, but in its place came stories that were darker, weirder, and sometimes unlike anything readers had ever seen before. From experimental nightmares to mainstream crossovers, these are the novels that proved horror was far from dead, and the data doesn't lie. Welcome back to Fantasy for the Ages. I'm Jim, co-host of this channel with my son Zach, but I'm flying solo today for our next installment in the series ranking the 3 best horror novels of each year through the decades. We've already survived the eerie 60s, the bloody 70s, the blockbuster 80s, and the shifting sands kind of weirdness of the 90s. Now it's time to dive into the 2000s, when horror found new ways to haunt us through unconventional storytelling, genre blending, and bold new voices that carried the genre into the modern age. As always, remember, these rankings are not my personal opinion. Instead, I used a formula that gives the greatest weight to long-term sales, then factors in award recognition, and finally considers fan ratings averaged across Goodreads, Storygraph, and Amazon. Put it all together, and you get a definitive, data-driven ranking of horror greatness throughout the decade. So let's see which 3 novels from each year defined the 2000s. I kick off 2000 in 3rd place with a favorite book of mine, though most of you won't think of it as horror, but it has horror elements. Stormfront by Jim Butcher. This is urban fantasy and detective horror. It's book 1 of the incredible, highly entertaining Dresden Files. Harry Dresden, Chicago's only professional wizard and private investigator, is drawn into a grisly double murder involving black magic. As both the police and a deadly sorcerer close in, Harry must uncover the truth while protecting himself from powerful enemies. It's a gritty urban fantasy that introduces the Dresden Files series with a mix of noir detective work and supernatural danger. The second best book of the horror category in 2000 is The Resurrectionists by Kim Wilkins. This is gothic horror and a standalone novel. Natalie Glass discovers disturbing secrets in her family's ancestral home in England, linked to an ancient cult obsessed with resurrection. As visions and hauntings plague her, she unravels a terrifying past that refuses to stay buried. The novel blends gothic atmosphere, psychological suspense, and supernatural horror into a chilling tale. But in first place for 2000, the data points to Innocence by Jane Mendelsohn. This is gothic and literary horror and is a standalone novel. A teenage girl named Beckett Granger navigates high school life after the loss of her mother, while sinister forces threaten her sense of safety and reality. As she becomes entangled in eerie rumors of vampiric teachers and strange deaths, the line between adolescence and nightmare blurs. The story is a haunting allegory of coming of age, innocence lost, and the terrors lurking beneath suburban normalcy. Moving to 2001, our 3rd best horror novel of the year is Angel of Ruin by Kim Wilkins. Kim's making an appearance here. The genre here is horror and dark fantasy, and it's a standalone novel. Sophie, a skeptic turned author researching the occult, becomes entangled with a mysterious figure called the Wanderer, who tells her an uncanny tale of 3 sisters torn apart by an angel. As the story unfolds, the line between reality and myth blurs, and ancient forces awaken in disquieting ways. The second best horror novel of the year is the unusually named Father Panic's Opera Macabre by Thomas Tessier. This is psychological horror and historical mythos, a standalone novel. A historical fiction writer confronts his own past when he uncovers atrocities committed during the Balkan conflicts. He must navigate the shape-shifting line between narrative, memory, and moral horror as he wrestles with the ghosts of collective trauma. Though less commercially known, Tessier's exploration of grief, guilt, and the haunting weight of history resonates with readers who appreciate psychological depth in literary horror. But the number one horror novel of the year is Dreamcatcher by Stephen King. Ever since he showed up, King keeps lurking decade after decade. This is science fiction horror with an alien invasion vibe, and it's a standalone novel. Four childhood friends reunite for their annual hunting trip in the Maine woods, and instead step into a harrowing battle with extraterrestrial parasites and government conspiracies. As the outbreak spreads, they must rely on their psychic bond and past trauma to survive a nightmare that defies explanation. Blending body horror, emotional suspense, and alien horror, Dreamcatcher became an instant bestseller and was adapted into a 2003 film. Continuing on to 2002, the third best horror novel of that year is Coraline by Neil Gaiman. This is dark fantasy horror, and it's focused on middle grade readers but widely read by adults. It's a standalone novel. Young Coraline Jones discovers a hidden door in her new home that leads to an eerie other world, an unsettling reflection of her own reality where her other mother wants to keep her forever. As the truth of the world's darkness unfolds, Coraline must use her wits to save herself and those she loves. Awarded the 2003 Hugo, Nebula, and Bram Stoker Awards, this book is valued for its unsettling mix of whimsy and genuine menace. Second best horror novel of the year is Lullaby by Chuck Palahniuk. This is horror and satire and is a standalone novel. A journalist investigating a wave of sudden infant death syndrome cases discovers they all trace back to a mysterious culling song from an old children's book, and soon learns the song has deadly supernatural power. As the bodies pile up, he and a friend uncover further chants that can manipulate life and love, turning their investigation into a dark, surreal spiral. The novel fuses horror and twisted dark humor with Palahniuk's signature punch, exploring obsession, grief, and the extremes of control. The number one horror novel of the year, based on the data, is From a Buick 8 by Stephen King. This is supernatural horror and a mystery, and is a standalone novel. A group of Pennsylvania state troopers guard a mysterious 1953 Buick Roadmaster that's not quite of this world. Over the years, they witness strange, often deadly phenomena emanating from the car's trunk. Events that defy logic or explanation. While more meditative than some of King's work, it's praised for its creeping dread, small town camaraderie, and the slow burn revelation of cosmic horror lurking behind the mundane. I've said in this series before, I have not read all of these books. I've just researched them, but this one I did read, and it's weird, but the creep, it's there. Let's go to 2003, where the number three horror novel of the year goes to The Taking by Dean Koontz. This is apocalyptic horror and science fiction horror. It's a standalone novel. When a bizarre, luminous rain falls over the world, a small mountain community faces terrifying changes in the landscape and encounters with impossible creatures. Molly Sloan and her husband Neil must face a reality that might be an alien invasion or something far stranger and more biblical. Fans praise the book's tense, cinematic pacing and unsettling blend of alien and supernatural menace, along with Kuntz's knack for eerie, end-of-the-world imagery. The second best horror novel of the year goes to Song of Susanna by Stephen King. This is dark fantasy horror genre mashup and is the sixth book of the seven-book The Dark Tower sequence. Roland Deschain's Quartet faces fractured timelines and an increasingly dangerous journey to the tower. as Susanna struggles with an otherworldly pregnancy and a second sinister personality. The narrative weaves metafiction, horror, and Western tropes into a surreal crescendo. Known for its escalating stakes and psychological tension, it's a key step towards the saga's epic conclusion and a showcase of King's genre bending mastery. But the number one book in the horror genre is a little outside the box, but it's definitely horror adjacent. I'm giving this by the data to The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. So, horror adjacent, a religious conspiracy thriller. This is book 2 of 5 in the Robert Langdon series. Harvard symbologist Robert Langdon becomes entangled in a murder mystery that leads to cryptic codes, Renaissance art, and a shadowy secret that could shake the foundations of Christianity. Alongside cryptographer Sophie Neveu, he races across Europe to stay ahead of a relentless secret society. One of the best-selling novels of all time, The Da Vinci Code gripped readers with short, page-turning chapters, historical intrigue, and a blend of real-world art, architecture, and religious mystery. Continuing to 2004, the third best horror novel of the year is Giants of the Frost by Kim Wilkins again. This genre is dark fantasy horror and is a standalone novel. In a remote English forest, alumnus Sarah unleashes an ancient immortal foe named Cernunnos. Not sure if I have the name right, whose return rekindles dark folklore and a fatal, timeless bond. Her sanctuary becomes a black forest where magic and mortality exact steep tolls. Rich in mythic resonance and lyrical world building, this stands as one of Wilkins' most atmospheric and mature works. Second best novel for this year is In the Night Room by Peter Straub. This is horror and a supernatural thriller. It's a standalone novel as written, though a sequel in plot effect to Lost Boy, Lost Girl. A grieving father named Underhill, recovering from a personal tragedy, relocates to a renovated house where his writing and nightmares begin to bleed into reality, making him question what's causing a series of eerie supernatural occurrences. Each page blurs the lines between creative imagination, existential dread, and something more malevolent lurking beyond the walls. Straub weaves psychological unease with unsettling metaphysical horror in a way that keeps readers off balance and deeply engaged. But the number one book in the horror genre for 2004 has to go to The Dark Tower by Stephen King, the final book of the 7-book Dark Tower series. This is dark fantasy and horror and was many years in the making. It actually won the 2005 British Fantasy Award. Roland Deschain's Odyssey concludes with heartbreak and cosmic deja vu as he finally reaches the tower, only to discover the journey may reset endlessly, questioning fate, redemption, and narrative destiny. Emotionally devastating and genre-defining, this book wrapped up King's magnum opus with philosophical and mythic weight, celebrated by fans and critics alike. Continuing on to 2005, the third best horror novel of the year is Already Dead by Charles Houston. This is a noir horror thriller, and while a standalone novel, it launches Houston's Joe Pitt series. In a gritty, modern New York, master vampire hunter Joe Pitt navigates mob conflicts, vampire clans, and a spreading zombie-like plague, all while relying on street smarts and code. A thrilling fusion of noir, horror, and urban fantasy. This novel launched an enduring series and earned a dedicated cult following, drawn to its sharp prose and dark cityscape. Second best horror novel of the year goes to Haunted by Chuck Palahniuk. This is horror and satirical dark comedy and is a standalone novel. A group of desperate writers locked in an isolated retreat trade tales of depravity and darkness. Each short story peeling back more layers of psychological horror in a framed narrative. A daring blend of satire, body horror, and emotional depth, Haunted earned a place in the genre for its intensity and its darkly compelling commentary on storytelling itself. The number one book of 2005 in the horror category, though, goes to 20th Century Ghosts by Joe Hill. This is a horror short story collection and is a standalone collection. It is the debut collection put forward by author Joe Hill. This collection delivers a suite of short, sharp tales, ranging from supernatural hauntings to sharp, ironic slices of the uncanny, each in Joe Hill's poetic, emotionally resonant voice. Hill's published debut heralded a fresh voice in modern horror. With prestigious awards and heartfelt stories, 20th Century Ghosts became foundational in contemporary short-form horror. Let's take a look at 2006. The third best horror novel of this year goes to Dark Harvest by Norman Partridge. This is folkloric horror and is a standalone novel. In an eerie Midwestern town, young men embark on an annual Dark Harvest ritual, chasing a pumpkin-headed creature called Sawtooth Jack before it reaches the church to claim its prize. The hunt is brutal, uncanny, and symbolic, mixing coming-of-age dread with supernatural dread. When tradition turns violent, the hunters face existential horror beyond folklore. Second best horror novel of the year is Ghost Road Blues by Jonathan Mayberry. This is both supernatural horror and zombie horror, and is book one of the Pine Deep trilogy. When eerie murders and dark rituals plague Pine Deep, Pennsylvania, a group of teens and ex-cops confront an ancient evil awakening in their haunted hometown. As horror blends with nostalgia, they must face darkness, both supernatural and all too human. The town's fate hinges on confronting historic trauma reanimated. The number one horror novel of the year is The Harrowing by Alexandra Sokoloff. This is supernatural, haunted house horror and is a standalone novel, her debut novel. A group of troubled college students stay behind in a foreboding dormitory over Thanksgiving. Yeah, nothing bad has ever happened in the horror genre when that was done. And they unwittingly invoke a fatal presence through a Ouija board. Idiots! As isolation reveals hidden guilt and malevolence, survival hinges on unraveling the dark spirit among them. Terror builds as the unseen force preys on their darkest fears. Its claustrophobic tension and psychological horror earned Sokoloff both critical attention and genre respect. The novel is praised for its atmospheric dread, methodical pacing, and tight emotional focus. You gotta give it something if it can be the best horror novel of the year with such obvious tropes. It tells you how well written this novel actually is. Continuing to 2007, the number 3 horror novel of the year is Dead Sea by Brian Keene. This is zombie horror, a love of mine, and a standalone novel. Again, not my picks. The data points us here. In a world overrun by zombies, survivors find refuge on an old ship, but soon discover that isolation may be more dangerous than the undead outside. Keene brings relentless pace and visceral body horror, delivering a gripping, claustrophobic zombie nightmare, like a tight, ocean-bound thriller. The second best horror novel of the year is Ghoul, also by Brian Keene, published here in the same year. This is dark fantasy horror and is a standalone novel. A trio of friends discover a ghoul lurks among the graves of their hometown's cemetery, and their families may be hiding darker secrets than the creature itself. Anchored by childhood perspective and brutal inevitability, Ghoul blends emotional depth and horror. The number one horror book of the year is Heart-Shaped Box by Joe Hill. Supernatural horror, this is a standalone novel and is Joe's debut full-length novel. Retired rock star Judas Coyne collects morbid memorabilia. until he purchases a ghost attached to a funeral suit, unleashing terrifying consequences. Hill's emotional storytelling and tight plotting made this an instant horror classic. It earned the 2007 Bram Stoker Award for Best First Novel and became a bestseller. Now let's take a look at 2008, where the third best horror novel is Pandemonium by Daryl Gregory. Speculative horror and fantasy, this is a standalone and also a debut novel. In an alternate America, demonic possession is alarmingly commonplace. Dormant demons awaken in ordinary people, leading to profound and often tragic consequences. Encyclopedic historian Jack Tenshi struggles to document these possessed folks as he unravels both personal and societal fractures amid a chilling supernatural resurgence. Second best horror novel of the year is The Seance by John Harwood. This is gothic, historical horror, and is a standalone. Set in Victorian London, Constance Langdon inherits Rexford Hall, and with it, inheritance of ghostly visions, and a family curse tied to a disastrous seance. As supernatural forces awaken, the boundaries between supernatural longing and fatal horror blur in this richly atmospheric gothic tale. This is Harwood's debut novel, merging gothic horror and psychological depth, capturing the uncanny elegance and dread of Victorian ghost stories. But the number one book in the horror genre was a real wow, out of nowhere type book, The Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman. This is children's fantasy and horror adjacent, quite clearly. It's a standalone novel. And I gotta tell you, it ticked up the awards. It won the 2009 Newbery Award, which is, the best children's book of the year, but also the 2009 Hugo Award for Best Novel, the 2008 Locus Award for Best Young Adult Book, the 2010 Carnegie Medal, and numerous other award nominations. People didn't quite know where to categorize this book. They just all agreed it was good. Nobody Bod Owens, the only survivor of a family massacre, is raised by ghosts in a graveyard. As he grows, Bod learns supernatural abilities and gradually confronts the man Jack, blending hauntingly tender storytelling and gothic dread in this imaginative, gently chilling odyssey. A magical blend of whimsy and horror, The Graveyard Book turned into an instant classic. Its phenomenal accolades across both children's and adult literary communities underscore its lasting emotional power and craft. Now let's take a look at the last year of the decade, 2009, where the third best horror novel goes to Her Fearful Symmetry by Audrey Niffenegger. This is gothic supernatural horror and is a standalone novel. Twin sisters move into their aunt's flat beside Hillgate Cemetery in London and discover a haunting overlap between identity, obsession, and spectral presence. As they confront grief, the uncanny intrudes on everyday life, and loss reveals unexpected legacies. This is a stylish and emotionally layered ghost story, blending literary finesse with eerie resonance and psychological depth. Second best novel of 2009 in the horror category is Dark Places by Gillian Flynn. This is a little bit of a genre mashup, being a mystery and a psychological thriller with strong horror elements. It's a standalone novel. Libby Day, survivor of a family massacre, reinvestigates her past and the associated societal hysteria to confront what really happened and what she's believed all her life. Dark Places provided a dark, layered analysis of memory and trauma with compelling prose. And the number one horror novel of 2009 goes to Let the Right One In, the US English edition. This is by John Iveda Lindqvist. This is vampire horror and a coming-of-age story, and is a standalone novel, the author's debut novel. Now, I have to note, it was originally published in 2004 in Swedish. This is the initial English language version that comes out in 2009. A lonely young boy in suburban Sweden forms a tender bond with a mysterious neighbor who turns out to be centuries old. Their friendship shimmers with quiet dread and haunting innocence. This is a beautifully written, emotionally resonant vampire novel that became an international phenomenon, inspiring acclaimed films and stage adaptations, fully embraced by English speaking horror audiences since its 2009 translation. And there you have it, the 30 novels in the horror genre that rose above all the others in the 2000s. Some pushed boundaries, some terrified in fresh ways, and others reminded us why horror is such a resilient genre. Together, they shaped a new era for dark fiction. Did your favorite make the list? Or do you think the data overlooked a hidden gem from the 2000s? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Spoiler light, please, and let's compare notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like, subscribe, and notification bell over there so you don't miss when we dive into the next decade. And of course, a huge thank you to all of our Patreon supporters. You're the reason we can keep series like this coming out to you all. Next time, we will head into the 2010s, when horror exploded back into the mainstream spotlight with unforgettable bestsellers, breakout authors, and a surge of fresh terror for a new generation. Until then, keep reading late out into the night, and ignore those spooky sounds coming from the basement or perhaps the backyard. I'm sure it's nothing. We'll talk to you next time.